News of the Times. Murder by Fire. The Notting Hill Tragedy of 1881. True Crime. Welcome to News of the Times. In the heart of Notting Hill, long before Hugh Grant and bookshops, stood a modest furniture shop and lodging house, hiding secrets as combustible as its walls. One spring night in 1881, flames consumed the building and 6 lives were lost. Was it an accident or something far more sinister? As investigators sifted through the ashes, suspicions fell on the very man who escaped unscathed and fully dressed. Insurance papers, whispered threats, and the haunting silence of those who never made it out. The deeper the inquiry went, the more chilling it became. Join us for a gripping descent into a forgotten Victorian crime of fire, fraud, and fatal consequences right on Portobello Road. And in today's end of episode for the particular segment, we pivot with only mild whiplash from arson and betrayal to a cautionary tale of fashion gone feral. Yes, while Notting Hill burned, elsewhere in the land, someone was getting gradually strangled by their own corset. It's Victorian England. If it wasn't crime, it was crinoline. If this episode, where combusted greed meets Victorian cautionary tales of killer corsets, appeals to the dark and quirky side of your nature, do consider liking, subscribing, and sharing. It helps baffle the YouTube algorithm, which now believes we're a specialist channel for 19th century undergarment fatalities. Let's not correct it, let's simply confuse it further. And now, with our bodices braced and laces loosened, we return to murder most foul by fire, fraud, and Portobello Road misfortune. Background. William Nash and Anna Maria Wright were not husband and wife, although they lived as such. Nash, 26, was a dairyman and sometimes dealer by trade. His partner, Anna Marie, 29, was a spinster. The pair were described as being in very poor circumstances, having previously rented a single room for 2 shillings and sixpence a week before moving into 2 rooms at 422 Portobello Road in February of that year. Their time at the new address was marked by financial strain. Nash was 7 weeks behind on the rent and owed for gas. His attempt to run a greengrocer's failed swiftly, and it would be revealed that nearly all the furniture in the shop belonged to the landlord. Despite this, Nash managed to insure his limited stock and furnishings for £120, value approximately £20,000 in 2025, a sum wildly above their actual value. The couple's living situation was cramped, precarious, and shared with several other families in the lodging house. Yet it was this very poverty, poorly built, inflammable, and dangerously overcrowded, that would become the epicenter of a most haunting arson case in the Victorian era. In the early 1880s, Portobello Road lay on the boundary of Kensington's Grand Crescents and Notting Hill's notorious slums. Once rural farmland, it had transformed into a bustling, densely packed corridor of terrace shops and crowded lodgings, squeezed between Victorian villas and makeshift hovels. By 1881, this side of Notting Hill, where William Nash and his partner lived, was filled with working class families, Irish immigrants, artisans, costermongers, and a fair few individuals teetering on the brink of destitution. Houses were subdivided into single rooms for rent. Utilities were shared if they existed at all, and overcrowding was the norm. With so many tragedies of the Victorian era, the warning signs were there, just obscured by soot, silence, and the sort of grim determination that came from being perpetually behind on the rent. William Nash and Anna Marie Wright were struggling, scraping together a life amid cramped lodgings and diminished prospects, surrounded by neighbours similarly one missed payment away from ruin. But on the night of the 15th of May, 1881, something far more final than eviction unfolded on Portobello Road. From the Denton and Horton Examiner, the 21st of May, 1881, fatal fire at Notting Hill. At 10 minutes to 1 on Monday morning, a fire broke out on the premises of William Nash, a furniture dealer and broker residing at 442 Portobello Road, Notting Hill. The flames were first seen by a gentleman who was returning home and who immediately gave information to the police and to the officer duty at Fire Brigade Station in Ladbroke Grove. No time was lost in the dispatch of either engines or fire escapes, but so rapidly had the fire taken possession of the premises that the building was one mass of flames before their arrival. The first fireman on the scene could see in passing that the house was severely damaged from the heat of the flames, which extended halfway across the street, with flames shooting out from every window and even from the shop door. It was known that several persons were inside the building, but the fire was raging so furiously that it was impossible to force an entry into the house. All the brigade could do was to endeavour to stay the spread of the conflagration. The houses on either side were filled with smoke, and the terror-stricken inhabitants had barely time to get out before. The house being as it was of match boards for floor and ceilings, the flames made it an easy prey. While the cruel work went on, Nash and his family, who, residing on the ground floor, had effected their escape, had only to stand without and watch the expiring flames which were scorching the inmates of the upper stories, for there was no hope. Even the chance of throwing themselves out of the windows was shut off, for to rush to any outlet was to court instant death. The victims: Elizabeth Jackson, a widow, aged 40, Anne Bond, 45, Philip Jackson, 10, Mr. Church, a visitor, aged 50, Louisa Church, his daughter, aged 10, and John Bond. All perished. At the back of Nash's shop was another, kept by a man named Keane, who owned a milk walk. He succeeded in getting his family out, but it is doubtful whether all the inmates of the place are accounted for. Owing to intense heat, which still remains, no thorough search has yet been made for remains. Portions of bodies, however, have been recovered, and they have been removed by order of Inspector Phillips to the mortuary at Kensington. The cause of the fire is unknown. The rapidity with which it seized hold of the premises is accounted for from the inflammable materials of which it was constructed. The sad event was the scene of the disaster being visited by large numbers of persons who hang around the spot, watching the search being made by the men of the Salvage Corps, who are now engaged in looking for human remains. In the days following the fire, as the ashes cooled and the community gathered in hushed clusters outside the ruins, troubling details began to emerge. Details that would shift the public mood from grief to suspicion. Why had only the ground floor occupants escaped? Why were they fully dressed? And why had insurance documents survived the blaze more robustly than human lives? As whispers turned to allegations, the case moved from the streets of Notting Hill to the stern benches of Hammersmith Police Court, and there the questions only multiplied. From the Daily News, the 15th of June, 1881, the fatal fire at Notting Hill. At the Hammersmith Police Court yesterday, William Nash and Annie Wright were examined on the charge of being concerned in wilfully setting fire to the house 422 Portobello Road, Notting Hill, resulting in the death of 6 persons. Witnesses who had been examined before the coroner was called, one being John Baldwin Darville, the landlord of the house. This witness stated that the shop and parlour were occupied by the prisoners who lived there as man and wife. Witness used the front kitchen in which he stored furniture. The prisoner Nash had been a tenant for 3 months at 7 shillings a week. At the time of the fire, he was 7 weeks in arrears. Witness had pressed him for the money. The prisoner commenced business as a greengrocer, but failing, witness put some furniture in the shop for the woman to sell. Everything in the shop belonged to the witness except a pair of scales and a box. He never saw what the prisoner had in the parlour, but he believed the whole of his furniture did not exceed 25 shillings in value. It was a double-fronted shop with a fanlight over the door. Witness said the door of the kitchen was locked and he kept the key. The fire did not commence in the kitchen as the furniture was not destroyed. The burning beams which fell had scorched it a little. The evidence of Nash was to the effect that he went out with his wife on Sunday the 15th of May and returned home at a little after 11 o'clock. That they went to bed at past, and he was awoken by his wife and found the room full of smoke. He ran upstairs and he went out for the fire escape, but he did not see where the fire was. Mr. Robert Harris, a journalist residing in Ladbroke Grove Road, said he slept in the back room on the ground floor nearly opposite the house, and at 12:30 he was awoken by the crackling of fire. He got up, looked out of the window and saw the shop on fire. He saw into the shop and the fire appeared to be burning on each side at the extreme corners, a blank in the centre and flames forming an arch. He ran out for the fire escape, which was about 300 yards from his door. He did not see the prisoner. Another witness, Leach, said he went for the fire escape and saw Mr. Harris. He had known Nash for 12 years. He did not see him till after the fire and the recovery of the bodies. No one put his hat on the escape while he put his cardigan jacket over his head. He had known Nash as a respectable man. Moore, a fireman, said he had charge of the escape in the Ladbroke Grove Road. On the 16th of May at 12:30, Mr. Harris gave him the alarm. He took the escape with the assistance of Mr. Harris and Police Constable Leach. At a short distance from the fire, a railway porter assisted with the escape. When Mr. Harris fell out to get his boots, witness did not see Nash. There was no other fire escape nearer than the one in the Harrow Road, 3/4 of a mile off. Other evidence was given to show that the fire did not occur in the basement. William Robert George MacDonald, clerk in the office of the Yorkshire Insurance Company, Old Broad Street, produced a copy of the policy obtained by the prisoner Nash in March last on this household furniture, etc., for £126, approximate value of £20,000 in 2025. Mr. William Willett, surveyor to the Cons Pay, produced a claim which had been handed to him by the prisoner for the sum of £79, approximate value £12,275 in 2025. At this stage of the proceedings, a further remand was granted, all the witnesses, with the exception of two, being bound over to appear at the session. As public suspicion hardened into formal accusations, the matter advanced from preliminary inquiries to the grand stage of the Central Criminal Court. No longer merely a tragic fire, this was now a murder trial, with all the grim spectacle and high-stakes consequence Victorian justice could muster. With the gallery packed and the newspapers hungry for scandal, the Crown laid out its case, not one of misfortune, but one of murderous intent, fueled by desperation, debt, and a suspiciously generous insurance policy. From the Evening News in London on the 4th of August 1881, the Notting Hill murder case. At the Central Criminal Court yesterday morning, before Mr. Justice Grove, William Nash, 28, dealer, and Annie Maria Wright, 29, spinster, were charged with the wilful murder of Elizabeth Jane Clark. Mr. Poland and Mr. Mead prosecuted for the public prosecutor. Mr. Ribton defended the prisoners. In stating the case to the jury, Mr. Poland assured the jury that the evidence to be brought before them would require their serious and anxious attention. The substance of the case was that on the morning of the 16th of May, the prisoners, according to the allegations of the prosecution, intentionally set fire to the dwelling house in which they were living, and in that consequence of that felonious act, they caused the death of the woman named on the indictment and 5 other persons named David Bond, Philip Clark, Harry Church, Louisa Church, and Anna Bond. The prisoners were living at the house 422 Portobello Road, Notting Hill, as man and wife, and they were no doubt in difficult circumstances. They occupied the ground floor of the premises. On the first floor was living Mr. James Keane and his wife and child, and on the 3rd floor the other persons named. The premises at 11:30 o'clock on the night of the fire was evidently safe, but an hour later the female prisoner went upstairs to the 1st floor and knocked at the door of Mr. Kern's room, calling out that the place was in flames. She also knocked on the rooms of the other floors, but the flames had by this time spread so rapidly that the deceased woman named and 6 other persons were burned to death. Mr. Keane, having roused his wife and child, put them out onto the leads. A short time after, he noticed that the woman Wright had a dress over her nightgown, and on proceeding downstairs observed that the shop was on fire in 2 places, and that the male prisoner was fully dressed. Keane, addressing Nash, said, "You know something of this?" Upon which Nash replied, "Look to yourself," and the two then forced open the street door and left together. On the 7th of March, the prisoners, having commenced the occupation of their house on the 15th of February, effected an insurance in the Yorkshire Insurance Office. His stock in trade was insured for £50, his household for £50, and his trade fixtures for £20. Nash, having informed Keane that he intended to insure his premises, the latter said, "You'll never get a policy. You have nothing to insure." Nash said he would get a policy, and he subsequently did. After the fire, Nash made a claim upon the insurance company for £79, approximate value £12,300 in 2025. The allegation of the prosecution was that the prisoners were in pecuniary difficulties and that they effected an insurance upon their goods, and in order to secure the money, they wilfully set fire to the premises. Mr. J. Dorrell, the landlord of the house occupied by the prisoners, was called and said that Nash owed him 7 weeks' rent at the time of the fire and a sum for gas. The case is proceeding. Several other witnesses were called. One of them stated that the prisoner Nash called him into his house on one occasion and said, "Wouldn't this place burn well with a good fire and the gas well on?" Shortly afterwards, the further hearing of the case was adjourned until this day. As the trial pressed on, the courtroom became a crucible of competing narratives. The prosecution leaned heavily on circumstance and suspicion, the defence on gaps and good character. But the jury was not asked to pass judgment on character. They were asked to decide whether the fire that gutted 422 Portobello Road had been lit with intent. Now, with weeks of testimony behind them and the weight of 6 lives before them, the jury would soon be called to deliver their verdict. And as the final arguments were laid out and the judge prepared to sum up the law, the case reached its boiling point. From the Daily News, the 5th of August 1881, the fatal fire at Notting Hill. Verdict and sentence. At the Central Criminal Court yesterday, before Mr. Justice Grove, William Nash, 26, and Anna Maria Wright, 29, were again placed at the bar upon the charge of the wilful murder of Elizabeth Jane Clark by wilfully setting fire to a house occupied by them, in which the deceased was at the time, and thus causing her death, there being 5 other persons by the same felonious act. As the prosecution rested its case, an edifice built on circumstantial timber and fuelled by the flame of suspicion, the defence rose to offer its counter. Mr. Ribton, seasoned and sharp, took the floor with the unenviable task of convincing the jury that what looked like arson and murder was, at worst, misjudgment and misfortune. He urged them to look past the smoke and examine the embers of reasonable doubt, to weigh not just the horror of the outcome, but the evidence, or lack thereof, that pointed to intent. And with that, the defence began its final push. Mr. Ribton, for the defence, addressed the jury, and he observed that, after all, it was a question for them whether, upon such facts as had been disclosed in evidence, they would feel themselves justified in a case involving the questions of life and death in convicting the prisoners upon the charge that was preferred against them. They were charged with the crime of wilful murder, and he submitted that there was not a single fact nor a single atom of evidence to show that the prisoners or either of them ever contemplated the commission of such an offence. He then proceeded to call the attention of the jury to the evidence, and argued that upon all the facts they would be perfectly justified in convicting the prisoners of manslaughter only. He at the time expressed his opinion that a great deal of time and trouble would have been saved if the prisoners had been put upon their trial upon the other indictment, which charged them with wilfully setting fire to the house. The following evidence was then adduced for the defence. The defence then brought forward a string of witnesses designed to prove that not only did Nash and his partner bear good character, but also that the fault most likely had more to do with damage to chimneys than any purposeful attempt of arson. Witness Mary Louisa Bond said that she had known both the prisoners for several years, and they were at her house at Notting Hill on the night of the fire from 7 o'clock till 11 o'clock when they left. She said that she always considered both the prisoners bore very good characters, and it would take 10 minutes to go from her house to the house that they occupied. Charles Nash, the father of the male prisoner, said that between 2 and 3 o'clock on the morning of the fire, his son came to him partially dressed. Witness Francis Flam, a German in the service of Mr. Darvel, the landlord of the house, said he had been employed at the building since the fire, and on one occasion he saw smoke and sparks. A fire came down the chimney from the adjoining house. He could not say how many sparks he saw, but there were a good few of them. This took place on the second day after the fire happened. He afterwards observed that there was a hole in the chimney between the two houses, 8 inches long by 4 inches wide. Edward Manistry, a greengrocer, said that last week he examined the premises in consequence of something the last witness said to him, and he noticed the hole he had referred to. It was large enough for a man to put his head in. The hole was so hot at this time that he could not bear his hand in it. There must have been a good fire. Cross-examined, the witness stated that the prisoner Nash and his wife's brother, they did not live together after the fire, but the prisoner lived in the same house. That was all the evidence that was adduced for the defence. Mr. Ribton then summed up the case on behalf of the prisoners. Having heard the defence's efforts to reframe the blaze as tragic accident rather than deliberate act, the court now turned once more to Mr. Poland, leading the prosecution. His task was as grim as it was resolute. He reminded the jury of the stakes, the sequence, and the smoke-laced trail of testimony that pointed, he argued, not to coincidence, but to conspiracy. With careful cadence and rising insistence, he painted his picture of what had unfolded that night in Notting Hill, and why justice, he contended, must now see it clearly. The prosecution resumed the reply upon the whole case, and in the course of his speech particularly directed the attention of the jury to the fact that when the shop was in flames, the prisoner Nash did not make the slightest attempt to give an alarm or to obtain help, and that when the fireman arrived, he was found to be fully dressed and prepared to make his escape from the burning premises. The learned counsel, in the course of his address, admitted that the evidence was not so cogent against the woman as it was against the male prisoner. But as regarding the latter, he submitted that the charge had been abundantly proven, and that, however painful it might be for them to do so, it would be their duty to convict him of the offence of which he was accused. With both sides having made their final pleas, the court turned at last to Mr. Justice Grove, known for his meticulous grasp of legal nuance and the occasioned raised eyebrow. The case before him had offered no shortage of fire, both literal and figurative, but now it was time to distill passion into principle. In a measured tone, he began to walk the jury through the tangled threads of evidence and testimony, pausing only to clarify the law, emphasizing key points, and ensures that sentiment did not obscure reason. Mr. Justice Grove next summed up the case to the jury, and after observing that a very painful duty had been cast not only upon himself but upon them, he said he regretted to have to state that the learned counsel for the prisoners appeared to have couched his defence upon an attempt to induce them to disobey the law. And if juries were allowed themselves to be led away by such arguments as to have been urged upon them, they would neglect their duty, and it would be calculated to lead to the most mischievous of consequences. He went on to say that the law was clear, and he did not believe it had been ever seriously disputed, that if a person wilfully set fire to a house and another person lost his life in consequence of that act, in the eye of the law he was guilty of murder, and the jury would neglect their duty if they did not find him guilty of that offence, supposing that they should be satisfied that the prisoners or either of them were guilty of the original offence. The learned judge then commenced upon the evidence and said that, in the first place, they would have to consider the question whether the prisoners on either of them were proved to have wilfully set fire to the house and loss of life was the result. If they thought that this was proved, the prisoners were guilty of murder. The next question was whether the fire was accidental, in which case, of course, the prisoners ought to be acquitted. And the third question for them to consider was whether the fire was the result of neglect or carelessness, in which case, he said, they might convict the prisoners of manslaughter. But, he said, that he could not discover that there was any evidence to support the last named suggestion. The courtroom, by now hushed and airless, turned its full attention to the jury, 12 men tasked with weighing tragedy, motive, and the fine distinctions between recklessness and intent. After a short deliberation, the verdict was returned, one that would bring both resolution and a flurry of questions in the press and public alike. And with that, Mr. Justice Grove delivered his sentence, cool, crisp, and final. The jury retired to consider their verdict, and after being absent for half an hour, they returned into court and found prisoner Nash guilty of wilful murder, but strongly recommended him to mercy on the ground that he did not believe he had any intention of taking life. They found the other prisoner, Wright, not guilty. The prisoner Nash declared that he was innocent and that many of the statements that had been made against him were entirely false. Mr. Justice Grove, having put on the black cap in passing sentence of death, said it appeared to him that the jury could not have returned any other verdict than the one that they had done. They had recommended him to mercy, and he did not complain of that, but at the same time he must say it appeared to him that it was a very bad case. It appeared almost to be admitted that for the sake of obtaining the paltry amount for which he had effected an insurance upon his property, he had not scruples to put in jeopardy the lives of 10 human beings, and he had not taken the least step to give them alarm and enable them to escape. He would take care to forward their recommendation to mercy to the proper quarter, and that was all he could do in the matter. At present, his only duty was to pass the sentence of the law, and his lordship accordingly pronounced the ordinary formal sentence of death. The prisoner heard the sentence with perfect calmness. And then, in a final twist not uncommon in Victorian criminal justice, what seemed inevitable was quietly undone. Despite the conviction, the sentence, and the sombre black cap of Mr. Justice Grove, strings were pulled not by influence or wealth, but by argument. A well-timed letter, a solicitor with a steady pen, and just enough legal ambiguity gave pause to the gallows. And so, with a minimum of public fanfare and a maximum of bureaucratic flourish, the Home Secretary made his announcement. From the Evening London News on the 20th of August 1881, we are pleased to state that the Home Secretary felt warranted under all the circumstances in advising Her Majesty to respite the capital sentence with a view to its commutation to penal servitude for life, which was passed on August the 4th by Mr. Justice Grove on William Nash for the murder of 6 persons at Notting Hill who were burnt to death through Nash setting his house on fire. Mr. William Ribton of 14 Clifford's Inn took the prisoner's case up and on the 11th inst wrote the Home Secretary pointing out the points of law and fact which made in the prisoner's favour, and to this day he has received intimation of the respite. Was justice served for the 6 victims of the horrific fire? Questions remained. Further particulars. And now from murder and arson we turn inevitably, some might say, to corsets. For while Portobello Road was going up in flames, the residents of Kilburn faced a different kind of peril altogether, structural failure brought on by keen undergarment enthusiasm. Yes, it's time for our end of episode further particulars, in which we leave the scorched timbers of Notting Hill for the crushed livers of central Middlesex. Because in Victorian England it wasn't fire, it was fashion, and if you weren't careful, your corset would kill you before the arsenic wallpaper even got a chance. So, with appropriate solemnity and loosened stays, let us proceed. From the Illustrated Police News, the 28th of May, 1881. Suicide by tight lacings. The evils of tight lacings were shown at an inquest which was held by Dr. Danford Thomas, coroner for Central Middlesex, on Friday at the Albert Edward Tavern in Kilburn upon the body of Mrs. Amelia Jury, aged 48, 19 Bolton Road, Kilburn. Dr. Frederick Hill, in his evidence as to the cause of death, stated that upon making a post-mortem examination, he found that the stomach was contracted in the middle by a firm band, narrowing it to 1/8 of its usual size. So there was virtually 2 stomachs, and the contraction was on a level with the deep indentation on the liver, corresponding to where the stays were tightly bound round. The liver itself was highly contracted and was driven down very deep into the pelvis area, and was no doubt that had been produced by tight lacing. The coroner said that some time ago he had held an inquest where it was shown that the liver had been seriously injured through tight lacing, and perhaps these cases would act as a caution against the deadly practice now adopted. That concludes this episode of Murder by Fire, the Notting Hill tragedy of 1881. If these twin tales of flaming fraud and fatal fashion tickled your curiosity, why not return the favour? A like, a subscribe, or even a bewildered comment helps us baffle the mighty YouTube algorithm, which now believes we specialise in arson and Victorian shapewear mishaps. Honestly, we're not sure it's wrong. Want more? Over on our Patreon site, you'll find 500 plus ad-free episodes filled with true crime, fainting Victorians, and a wild wooden house influence, minus the butler. Your support helps keep the tea hot, the facts footnoted, and the corsets responsibly loosen. This has been News of the Times, and I'm Robin Coles, professional teapot interrogator, former champion of the 1911 Suspicious Footprints Symposium.